Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Wiener Holocaust Library. I'm Barbara Warnock from the library, and really delighted to welcome tonight Peter Lantos to speak about The Boy Who Didn't Want to Die, which has just been published in graphic novel form, and we've got the book on sale tonight, so we'll be able to help you with that afterwards. And I guess it's kind of the third version of your memoir, in a sense, that's been published.
Well, there is one which I will mention, which is Parallel Lines,
Yes.
which was published in 2006, and that is for adults. And it is my original journey, and also the journey which I made from London, covering exactly the same ground to remember what happened. And then I shouldn't tell you because I thought this was going to be the end of my talk. But sorry, I have to now say, but then I did write a book for children, and since it seemed to be going quite well, the publisher, Scholastic, decided to have a graphic version. And I was kind of rather concerned about graphic version. I didn't think that having written medical and scientific literature for 40 years, I would end up writing comics. But it happened, and when it was launched at Dawn, I found that Harari's Sapiens also has a graphic version. And if his book is in graphic version, I think I'm all right with a graphic version.
Yes, definitely. Yes, so welcome here tonight. Really delighted to welcome Peter, as I say, and this is our first exhibition event as part of our exhibition event series for our current exhibition, Traces of Belsen. And Peter is, of course, a really appropriate speaker because he is a survivor of Belsen, and he'll tell you about that. But a couple of things I've just realised today that are very relevant for the exhibition is that if you look at this photograph, I'm sorry for people online, you won't be able to see the photograph, but if you look at this photograph for people in the room to the right, so I'll just try and describe it for people online. It shows a group of women and children emerging from a train, and the photograph actually captures the very moment of their liberation by US soldiers. And this was a train sent pointlessly from Belsen by the Germans on its way to Theresienstadt that was eventually liberated at the end of the war. And Peter was on this train, and he even knows the identity of some of the people in the photograph, which is rather amazing. And I only just sort of realized Peter's connection with this photograph today. In addition, in Peter's book, he talks about seeing RAF reconnaissance aircraft flying over Belsen. And actually in the exhibition, we feature one of those photographs just there as a kind of diagram to just help people to understand what the camp was like. And if you look really closely at the photograph, it actually shows some of the prisoners as well who were gathered for a roll call. So you can actually sort of see prisoners at the time as the RAF flew over, taking the photograph of the camp. So it's brilliant to have Peter here, really, and obviously very appropriate. So yeah, the exhibition goes on to mid-July. There's other events. You can find out more on our posters near the door and also online. So now, without further ado, I will introduce Peter. So as we've said, his latest work is The Boy Who Didn't Want to Die, his story told for children from the point of view of a child who was at the time in Belsen, and it was shortlisted for the 2024 British Book Award and won the prize of the UK Literacy Association in the same year, and the graphic novel I've mentioned has just been published by Scholastic. So I'm not going to fill in too many details about Peter's life because he's going to do a lot of that themselves, but he was born in Hungary, as I've mentioned, survived Belsen. He was later back in Hungary, but came to Britain in 1968, where he had a very successful career, including being a professor of neuropathy at the Institute of Psychiatry at the Maudsley Hospital, and he was elected to the Academy of Medical Sciences in this country in 2001. And since retirement, he has embarked on his literary career that you've heard a little bit about. So I'll hand over now to Peter. There'll be a bit of chance for questions at the end, both from our in-person audience, and we can field questions online if people would like to put them in the chat. We'll be able to field them as well. So I'll hand over now to Peter.
Barbara, thank you very much for your kind words. And thank you very much for inviting me here to speak. There is also another thank you is due, which is delayed by more than 20 years, because I started to do my research for the past at the Wiener Library. After retirement, I decided to write what happened to my family in 1944-45. And the Wiener Library at the time was in Devonshire Place. And I happened to know one of the trustees who was neighbor, David Cohen, and he did write a letter of introduction. And this is where I started to do my research, which then led to several countries. What I try to do is a very informal talk. It's three parts. Very briefly, I will give a background what happened in Hungary in 1944 before our deportation. The second part, I talk about what I refer to as the journey, which is our deportation from a small provincial Hungarian town to Bergen-Belsen and back. And the third part, I will describe briefly what happened in the aftermath in Hungary, when Hungary turned into a one-party dictatorship. And finally, how I ended up here to tell you this story. What happened in 1944, that the Hungarian Jews, despite all the restrictions, were in a way in their homes. However, their extermination has two unusual features. One is the late occurrence, because by that time, most of the European Jewry had been or was going to be exterminated. The Hungarian Jews not. Why? Because Hungary was a faithful ally of Nazi Germany. And it would have been rather difficult to exterminate an ally citizens. But everything changed on the 19th of March, 1944, when Germany invaded Hungary. Eichmann came to Hungary, and with the full collaboration of the Hungarian authorities, the Hungarian Jews extermination started. So the one unusual feature is this. However, I should say that it didn't mean that Hungary didn't have anti-Semitic laws. In 1938 and 1939, there were three increasingly racist. The first law limited the number of Hungarians in professions, journalism, acting, public life, etc., and that was further decreased. The third law in 1939 was a racist law, exactly like the Nuremberg laws in Germany. However, there is an additional feature of Hungarian anti-Semitism, which is less known, that in 1920, which happens to be, I think, the first anti-Semitic law in modern Europe, Hungary introduced a law with the name numerus clausus, which means closed numbers. It meant that Jews couldn't go to universities in excess of their proportion in the general population. And since it exceeded at least twice, that obviously was a limiting factor. That is actually less well known, and that was 13 years before Hitler came to power in Germany. The second unusual feature of the extermination of Hungarian Jews, that from Nazi Germany point of view, it was the most successful chapter of the final solution. In 3 summer months of 1944, nearly 500,000 Hungarian Jews had been exterminated, mainly, but not exclusively, in Auschwitz-Birkenau. They were gassed immediately, practically on arrival. So what happened? I should have started that I am here because I was deported with my parents in the summer of 1944, from Hungary to Bergen-Belsen, I became 8,431 prisoner, and we returned to Hungary. My mother and my father died of starvation in Belsen. So what happened after the Germans invaded Hungary? They immediately had a master plan, which was obviously Eichmann. And the plan was first to collect the provincial Jews of Hungary in 6 major centers and deport them first. So in May 21st, we had to leave our home to go to the ghetto. It was a circumscribed area of the town. And obviously, I was not quite 5. And for a child of that age, it was complete uncertainty. I didn't know where we were going. My mother tried to explain why we have to go, had to leave my toys behind, and it was an entirely alien environment. But that was, in a way, the right introduction for what was to follow. We stayed in the ghetto in our hometown. I could tell you, it's a very small town. The name Mako is in the southeastern corner of Hungary, and very near to both to the Romanian and what was then Yugoslavia, now Serbian border. If you look it up, there is one thing which probably make you realize that it's an important town, not because I'm here, but because Joseph Pulitzer of the Pulitzer Prize was born in that town. And in fact, one of my aunts married in the Pulitzer family. It was a small town with, at its height, had 36,000 people with a Jewish population of 3,200, roughly 6–7%. So we stayed in the ghetto until the 16th of June, 1944, when we had to travel. For me, it was an excitement because I thought it was going to be a sort of an adventure, but in fact, it was a rather different travel. The only positive thing about was that it was a short journey, and we ended up in a collection camp with the name Szeged. For me, it's important because that is where 14 years later, I studied medicine and qualified from medicine in that town. We stayed there until the very end of June. Then they organized the Hungarians. I should say that we were deported, not by the Germans, but by Hungarians. And most of them did very enthusiastically. We then were allocated to 3 trains. There were rumors that we are leaving the country, where no one did know. Poland, ? Germany, ? Probably Austria. Most of my family were allocated to train number 1. My parents, my grandmother, my mother's mother, and I were allocated to train number 2. And that is quite important because one of my aunts wanted to convince my parents to join them, which would have been difficult, but my mother said no. Train number 1, on which most of my family members traveled, arrived in Auschwitz, and they were gassed. So if we were to join them, I wouldn't be here to tell you this story. So when they kind of celebrate survivors, surviving is not an achievement, but a question of luck. And in my case, obviously, that I survived, the credit goes not to me, but to my mother. So our train, after a long journey, which was quite difficult, in each wagon, they were not carriages, obviously they were wagons. Between 70, 90 people were crowded, couldn't lie down, couldn't sit down. I was lucky because I could sit on the shoes of my parents. Food was very little and then disappearing, and hygiene was represented with two buckets in one corner, and you can imagine their function, and you can also imagine what happened when, after some length of the journey. We didn't know where we were going. After a couple of days, it seemed eternity, we arrived, and we arrived, as my parents realized, in Austria. So the idea was to keep us alive. Why? Because by that time, the German Empire needed slave workers. The major source of slaves were in the East, in Ukraine, in Belarus, in Poland, and in Russia. But by the summer of 1944, the Red Army was gradually liberating those areas, and there were no more slaves from the East. So the idea was to keep some of the Jews alive to do some work. And after a while, my grandmother died. I tried to find out, went back to various archives in Austria 60 years later, as she didn't exist, but I know that she died there at the age of 70, and perhaps just as well, because in Belsen it would have been a great deal worse. My parents were selected by an employer who had a small building firm. Everyone was lined up, and the employers, potential employers, came and, just like on a slave market, pointed, you, sorry. And we were selected, and in a way it was a reasonable employment, because we had our own room. Food was very little, but there was, every day there was some food. And my parents' job was, with many other people, to go to repair roads. The town, it was outside a town, Wiener Neustadt, which is outside Vienna, and the importance of the place for the Allies, that it had a Messerschmitt factory, a German military plane, and the town was very often bombed. And in American military archives, I had even the dates when they bombed us while we were there. And that went on from July, I don't know the precise date, but the end of November. And the day started that a lorry came, my parents with others and myself, we were taken to the roads, they worked, repaired the roads, and the children tried to do some games, hitch and hike, etc. So it's relatively, for a child, was probably the best part of the journey. Everything changed at the end of November. I don't know the date, but I do know where and when our journey ended. We were put yet another train. The difference was equally crowded and equally unbearable, but as opposed to having the heat of the summer, we had the cold of the winter, because by that time it was quite cold, and we realized that we were traveling north. What I do know, that we arrived in Bergen railway station on the 7th of December, 1944. From there, we had to march through a small village, Belsen, hence the composite name, Bergen-Belsen, to a camp, and that was Belsen concentration camp. Again, we didn't know where we were going. My mother realized that where we were, she spoke very good German. And then our life in Belsen started. We were immediately separated. My father had to go to a different barracks for men. I stayed with my mother. I learned later that we stayed barrack number 11, which I could point out on that map. And we were there until the 6th of April. What was Belsen like? You saw the pictures, and I don't want to further talk about it. Just our day, our day unfolded. It started in pitch dark. It was winter, and we had a breakfast, which was some brown liquid coffee that it didn't taste much, and a slice of bread with a piece of cheese or some jam. Then my mother insisted that we ought to go to the bathroom. The bathroom was a half-open shed. On one wall there were dozens of taps, but all taps gave only cold water, so there was no hot water. Now you can imagine the fun a boy of 5 had being struck down in the ice cold air with a cold towel. But my mother was remorseless because she thought that we should keep clean, prevent getting lice, and with lice getting typhus. So that was the second part. The third part was the worst, when we had to be counted. We went back to the barracks, but we had to come out, and there was an upper Platz, a call-up place or a counting place, and they always counted us. Now, it seems to be a very simple and short maneuver, but in fact, it went on for a long time. First, because some people by then died during the night. A couple of people were so weak that they had to be dragged out and propped up. And then the numbers never agreed. So they always had to recount. And there was obviously an element of sadism by the guard. So we just stand there. You can imagine by that time it was bitterly cold, December. And Belsen is in northern Germany, in the middle of an enormous plain area, Lüneburg Heath, it's called. And it is well known for military purposes because it's a proving ground. It was for the Wehrmacht, later became for NATO, and for the British garrison, which stayed until probably, I think, 4 or 5 years ago, next to the camp, and they used it for military exercises. So it was bitterly cold. Then we went and had lunch. The lunch was always practically the same. It was referred to as Bergen-Belsen, which was a root vegetable soup. There were parsnip and turnips and occasionally potatoes. It was extremely rare to find kind of tiny piece of grizzle, but that was very unusual. The really indulgent day for food was when they distributed what the Red Cross delivered. And then we had some jam or sausages or cheese and some bread. The bread rations was gradually getting smaller, and my mother was extremely strict. If we had 3 days, there was no use me crying for more bread. She just allocated for the day. So she made sure that the bread ration lasted until it's supposed to. My father was in a different barrack, and we really could see him practically every day. And he also came to see us. That was possible. There was no much contact with other children. There was no areas to play, and it was bitterly cold. And even when spring came, it was still quite chilly. My father died in March 15, and I found his unofficial death certificate, which is quite unusual, in the archives of Belsen. A Hungarian doctor recorded the death. And I found my father, he was, I think, if I remember, 257 that recorded. But later, so many people died that the doctor obviously gave it up because couldn't record it. The cause of death is quite properly done. The cause of death is starvation, general weakening of the body, held by weak heart. It was a cardiomyopathy, as I later I mean, now I know what it is. So that was our life in Belsen. It turned for much worse later on. What happened? Many people appeared suddenly because concentration camp in the east had been evacuated. So some of the inhabitants came from Auschwitz who survived in Belsen and several other camps. So the camp, which was originally designed for 6,000 people, had 10 times more. And then with the overcrowding and lack of hygiene and infections, epidemic started, typhus, typhoid fever, dysentery, tuberculosis, and starvation. And people died by the dozens, by the hundred, by the thousand. And when the British arrived, there were apparently an estimated 10,000 unburied people. And then during the following couple of weeks, 13,000 more died. And on the day of liberation, 800 people died. So it was, Belsen in a way became hell on earth, not because the Germans invaded to get the inhabitants. On the contrary, they wanted to keep us alive. You probably know why, but the epidemic did actual job and people died. So that is why it became what the British Army found. The idea of Belsen that it was not an extermination camp, there were no gas chambers, and there was only one crematorium to burn people who died. But going back, I'm sure it's in the exhibition just very briefly, the first evidence of a camp was 1936, when it was 30 barracks for German and Polish workers. In 1939, after the war started, it became a prisoners of war camp, first for French and Belgian soldiers, and later for Soviets. By November 1941, there were, I think, 22,000 Soviet soldiers. And then only in 1943 became a concentration camp approved by Himmler himself. And the idea was to keep Jews alive, to exchange them for German citizens who got stranded behind enemy lines, that is, in Allied countries. And there were in fact two exchanges. And one happened on the 4th of December, which was 3 days before we arrived. And apparently we occupied some of their empty barracks. So that is the background of the history of Belsen. However, my mother and I, we were not there when the British arrived. The German, for reasons which we didn't know then, we don't know now, even German historians. The definitive book is written by Eberhard Kolbe in 1965. It's a very thick book. It was this abbreviated version is in English. Apparently a last-minute exchange, but it's not known. The destination of the 3 trains were Theresienstadt, a concentration camp outside Prague. But only one train arrived in Theresienstadt. Another train was liberated by the Red Army, and our train on the 13th of April, 1945, was liberated outside a small German village of Falsleben, and that is probably the best picture you can ever see. It was taken by Captain Benjamin, one of the Americans who was in charge of 2 tank commanders, about which I'll tell you later on, who liberated our trains. The train left Belsen only on the 7th of April, and until the 13th of April covered very little ground and went back, sometimes covered the same ground, and came to a halt outside Farsleben. And it is anecdotal, but apparently true, that the train driver lived in the very same village and left the train and later died of typhus. Now, I heard this from a villager who lived in that village, a very nice man who actually had a Russian wife. And that is the story. Whether it is true, it sounds good, so, you know. So we then were liberated by the Americans, who next day, they transferred us in a sort of compendium built originally for German officer in a village, Hillersleben. And the Americans looked after us for quite a long time. Then they left and the British came, they left after a short time. By then the war ended in Europe, 8th of May, and then the Russians arrived. And that area became the Russian zone of occupation, which later became the German Democratic Republic. The Americans gave us everything we needed and more. One problem was that people who starved for months started to eat uncontrollably, and many people died. And that happened in Belsen too, to the point that the British asked a very specialist scientist to go and study what sort of food the inmates should have. So we stayed there. But then when the Soviets arrived, it took a long time to get a proper communication, and they promised a train back to Hungary. The date of the departure was postponed. My mother wanted to go back to Hungary, mainly to find I had an elder brother, I should have said at the beginning, who was 14 years my senior, who was very good at high school, wanted to go to university, but of course couldn't. He was taken later to hard labor. He returned home and died at home of typhoid fever, which was misdiagnosed in the local hospital. But my mother obviously didn't know. So one day, she planned that it's an escape. We got on a goods train, and through Prague, we arrived back to Hungary. It was not a happy homecoming because my mother found that my brother had died, and it's a terrible event that he died only a couple of 2 weeks before we got home. And altogether, 21 members of my close family died. It was family was quite large. There were 8 siblings both on my mother and father's side. So many people died. I was at the time 6, I was quite thin. And I remember that it went on for a while, that my mother said, if on my 10th birthday, I will be 30 kilograms, it's metric, I will get my first watch. So I had to eat. But I didn't go to school because it was a little bit late. It was end of August, and the school in Hungary religiously starts on 1st of September. So what happened then? That is the aftermath. Hungary was liberated by the Red Army. They came as liberator and then remained as oppressors. Hungary was a sort of a liberal democracy from 46 to the end of 48, beginning of 49. There were free elections. There were parties from extreme left, communists. There were no fascist party, but right-wing parties. But gradually, with the Soviet army and political pressure in the background, first the right wing, then the central party, then the central left disappeared, then 2 parties remained, the Communist Party and the Social Democrats. The Social Democrats were an entirely different party, but then when they united, it became a single party, and there was a single party dictatorship until it ended formally in 89. Obviously, there were phases. The worst Orwellian 1984 was between 1950 and 53 when Stalin died. It got a little bit better, but not much. Then in 56, there was an uprising, the revolution, which was called then counter-revolution by the communists, which lasted 11 days. There was a terrible revenge. People disappeared and many people had been executed. And that it went on until the beginning of the 60s when it became more liberal. So that was the life. And then I decided at the age of 16, 17 that I want to become a doctor of medicine. And in that decision, the main factor was that having seen so many human suffering, which obviously I didn't forget, I wanted to have a profession in which I directly could help my fellow human being. And then the obvious choice was medicine. And I got with some difficulty into the medical university of Szeged, which was at the time best in Hungary and probably still, because there are 2 Nobel Prize winners. And 2 years ago, Katalin Karikó, who did the RNA work for which you are, well, if you are a certain age benefiting, the best COVID vaccines are based, and she graduated from the University of Szeged. So that is where I graduated. However, life was quite difficult. I was very fortunate because in 1966, I got a fellowship, research fellowship from the Wellcome Trust. Those who may not know, the Wellcome Trust is based on the fortune of an enormous pharmaceutical compendium, which existed both in the United States and in this country. And despite from the museum, they now removed Samuel Wellcome personal belonging because some is from slave work. Despite all their profit went for medical research, preference to African countries, preference for malaria and other infections. So I benefited from it. I was very lucky in 1966, and the stipend, the annual salary I had was £1,200, not per week or per month, but for a year, and which in 1966 was a reasonable salary. It was a salary of a junior doctor, but I didn't get an exit visa from Hungary in 1966. I couldn't, they didn't tell me why. They just said, the official don't. Apply next year. I applied for an exit visa. In 1967, they said no. The third time I applied in 1968, I got an exit visa and arrived on a rather gray, rainy, surprise, surprise, London evening at Heathrow Airport with £5 and a small suitcase. And I enjoyed my year of fellowship. I should have said that my mother died a couple of months before I left, so I was completely independent. At the end of the year, I decided to stay, and someone interviewed me just in the morning. Why? The reason was, it sounds like a cliche, because I discovered a free life. It is, in a way, for me, it was a big difference from coming Hungary and starting to live here. And it was really the personal freedom which was the major factor. Then it was the international tension, because it was, when I decided to stay, it was a year after I arrived in 1969, October, and that was 1 year after Czechoslovakia. And for me, as it reminded me of what happened in Hungary in 1956, when I was beaten by the police, but other people died. And so in a way, it was a different life, and obviously the work possibilities were different. And I was very fortunate. The Brits were very helpful. I immediately got a job. The welcome offered that if I wouldn't get a job, they extend my fellowship. But I got a job at the Middlesex Hospital, which exists no more. It was in Mortimer Street, a very good hospital. I became a consultant, senior lecturer in 76, and exactly 10 years after I decided to stay in this country, I was appointed to a chair at the Institute of Psychiatry, Maudsley, of neuropathology, from which I retired 23 or 4 years later, quite happily. So that is, in a way, my story. What I would like to do is just to tell you what happened. I will finish on time. That what I did when I retired, I had a list. What I should have done, but I didn't. And on the top of the list was Remember Belsen. And I started to kind of collect information, but I realized that I remember very little because I was 5 and 6. Of physical hardship, I remembered certain events like traveling, etc. So the idea came, which was a good one, to make the same journey again from London, which we had made 60 years earlier from Hungary. So I went back all the places we had been. I went to museum, military archives, talked to people who traveled on the same train from Hungary to Austria, from Austria to Belsen, people who were in Belsen. And that I accumulated, and I didn't want to write it as a book, but I did want to write an aid memoir. Cut this long story short, it turned into a manuscript. I showed it to a friend who is an editor and said, it's good enough, why don't you try to publish? So the end result is a book which is for adults, Parallel Lines, a journey from childhood to Belsen. It's parallel lines because of the railway track, the endless journey. It is also parallel of 2 journeys, the one I made with my parents in 1944 and 1945, and what I made on my own after retirement. And it's also to some extent because I write about life after we return in Hungary. It's a parallel between 2 extreme toxic ideology, fascism and communism. I don't equate the 2, but it is, in a way, both are extreme ideology. So that is the book which came about. And then during lockdown, it occurred to me, why don't I write the story for children? Not an old man remembers his childhood, but try to write from the point of view of a child I was at the time, telling the story for other children, and it turned into The Boy Who Didn't Want to Die, which the excellent introduction already described. So that is the story, but just to close, because it's a Belsen exhibition, an event which relates to Belsen. Our train was liberated by Americans, which I obviously I did know. The language was different, the uniforms were different. But I didn't know when I wanted to collect my memory, who were they? So I went to a military archives to find out which American unit was in that area in April 1945. And I found it out that it was the 743rd Tank Battalion of the 30th Division of the 9th US Army. It was then easy to find on the internet that the veterans have a journal. So I did write to the editor, would he publish a little note from me in the newsletter? The answer was yes. And I did write a very brief note. Would anybody of you remember liberating a trainload of mainly Jews traveling from Bergen-Belsen concentration camp to Prague, liberated on the 13th of April, 1945, outside the village of Farshaven. So I started to get responses. My grandfather talked about it. Here's a newspaper cutting, etc. Only after a week or so, I got a long email. We started greetings across the ocean in 60 years. My name is George Gross. I am one of the tank commanders, there were 2 tanks, who liberated Ukraine. And I was obviously amazed and delighted. And he was too, because he found a survivor from the train who is, in a way, his life is credit to some extent to him. So after a while, I got a letter, proper letter with 9 photographs. The largest is this one, which was not taken by him, but by Captain Benjamin. And other 8, which all taken by George Gross on the day of our liberation. And then he had explanation too. We started to correspond. And in the end, I decided to visit him. So I went to visit him in San Diego. By that time, he was obviously retired, because he's considerably older than I am. Introduced to his family, wife, 2 sons, one an archaeologist, the other a professional photographer who improved on the original photograph. And we spent a unforgettable day together. I don't know whether he was more moved or whether I was more moved, but we exchanged emails and remained friends until he died, I think 4 or 5 years ago. So that is the end of my story.
Thank you so much, Peter. That was brilliant and fascinating and very moving. So many elements of it so moving, but to finish on the note with George Gross is very interesting to hear. So we've said to people online that if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. Just to remind people in person as well that we do have the book "The Boy Who Didn't Want to Die" on sale, and this is special price. Is that right, Catherine? So it's £8 rather than £10.99. So it is reduced price if you'd like that. But yes, first of all, are there any questions from the audience in the room? Right, if you could just speak into the mic so that people online can hear.
And I can hear too.
So thanks for sharing, Peter. So my name is Kyle. I am a refugee come from China. And after I read your book, The Boy Who Don't Want to Die, and I find there is a page very inspirational for me. It's the page when the mother in the concentration camp tried to teach the son German. And the son said, don't we hate the Germans? And then the mother told, only those who want to kill us. We don't hate the language. So that I can relate, because I recognized my own language, Mandarin Chinese, is becoming the language of the oppressor against the Uyghur, the Tibetan in China's territory. So my question is, how exactly the learning experience of learning German influenced your life?
Well, what I can say, that was obviously a very brief event in the camp. However, I made a conscious decision when I was at high school to learn German. At the time, it was compulsory to learn Russian, which actually I did like, because A, it's a beautiful language, B, it has a fantastic literature. But there was a possibility to choose English, French, or German. And I think I consciously decided German. I cheated because privately I learned English. But at school for 4 years, I learned German, and that was part what I later became try to understand how come that a civilized European nations decides in the middle of the 20th century to exterminate millions of people on an industrial scale. So how come? So what is about the Germans? And that was the intention, to learn about them, to study the language, which is obviously beautiful. The problem is that you make the noun at 8 o'clock and the last verb you made 10 minutes later. But it's a fantastic language. And when I was 18, I was not fluent, but and then I decided as a medical student, when I was possible to travel behind the Iron Curtain, there was an exchange between medical universities of Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, to go to East Germany. So then I spent there a month. I made friends, German medical students, German doctors. Obviously, at the back of my mind, there was the question, what did your father do during the war? Which I never asked, but it was a part of the process of understanding and making peace what has happened. So that was the first step.
Thank you. So, question here.
Well, actually, it's not a question, it's comment, if I may. Utterly fascinating presentation, and it's an amazing privilege to meet you and hear you. I just like to stick up for Hungarians, just very briefly. As you rightly said, the first half of the 20th century did have a problem of anti-Semitism in Hungary. And you mentioned the numerus clausus law, which only allowed 5% of Jews to universities. So I'm a musicologist, music historian. So can I just mention that at that point, the Music Academy in Hungary totally ignored these rules and laws. And when they were supposed to be taking 5% Jews, they took 41. So I just thought I'd stick up for what is good about Hungary. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we've got a few more questions. So I'll go there and then there, and we've got some online as well. So I'll come to those.
My family had contemporaries of yours, including little Lily in Vienna and Jakob in Poland, who tragically didn't make it. So I have appreciation or respect that you survived, and also that you were able to build a life, because I know a lot of capable survivors who just didn't realistically have a chance, to do anything other than sort of survive afterwards. But my question is, you came across a lot of different people who had virulent attitudes towards Jews, whether they were Nazis, fascist Hungarians, communists. Do you have any observations about similarities and differences in their conceptions of Jews?
Differences in...
So any observations about similarities and differences between anti-Semitism from different groups? So, for example, communist anti-Semitism or pre-war Hungarian anti-Semitism or Nazi anti-Semitism?
Well, I think there are various types of anti-Semitism. There was, in fact, a snobbish anti-Semitism in certain circles, and there was the anti-Semitism which was very blatant. So it depends on the social standing of the people. But I have to say that when I was in Hungary, maybe because the religion was not promoted and it was not obvious, there was no obvious anti-Semitism. So people, there was no anti-Jewish manifestations. There was in an event in Stalin's Soviet Union against Jewish doctors. But by and large, it was not obvious that there was anti-Semitism. It was always under, but I never actually experienced at school. I started, oddly enough, in a Catholic school for the reason because A, that was the best in the town, and B, it was nearest, so it was easy to get in. And my mother was quite keen that I should go there. I was treated extremely well, and there was never, I think that the fourth teacher explained, or the priest explained my background, and I never had any problems there. That lasted only 2 years because communist takeover, there were no Catholic or Protestant school. I went to a boys' school, which originally was Protestant, but there was no sign. So everybody had to go there if belonged to that area. So I didn't personally experience anti-Semitism after the war. And I don't know how much, I was too young to know, but my grandfather had an enterprise in town. And it was not large by today's standard, but they employed 100 people, which in a small town in the 30s, it was substantial. And I know that he was well regarded. And when there was kind of restrictions, he was, I think, the second Jew who was still member of the local country club, so-called. Maybe because, I mean, it obviously was quite generous, but the family was kept in certain esteem because they apparently, I mean, I don't know, but they were quite good employers. And I do remember when, after the war, when it was closed down, the enterprise by the communists at the end of 1949, occasionally we walked in the street and my mother was stopped and someone said, Mrs. my mother's name, we have been very happy to work for your family, to which her mother said, don't even mention it.
Okay, thank you. So we've got another question in the room, then I'll go to one online and then I'll come to you.
Thank you. So I had a question about your experience writing this recent book. So I've recently become a mother and he's obviously too small to read yet, but in the future, what have you learned around kind of writing for children and kind of explaining such a kind of difficult concept? And yeah, is there anything to kind of advice really for me to kind of explain it to
How
them in
to
the
write
future?
children's book? I can't give it that, but I did write only one. But what I tried to do, which was quite difficult, to try to imagine what I felt, the cold, the hunger, etc., and try to express in the way a boy of 6 would do. It didn't always succeed because I had an editor and he came, look, you know, a boy of 6 wouldn't say that. So, and it went through 2 editors. I had my own editor because I was very uncertain that it would be actually the thing it should be. And then the publisher also had an editor. And there were, even the second editor had a couple of questions. It's very difficult to do that. And I never had any literary ambition in my life, apart from writing essays at high school. And when I started to write the first book for adults, which I thought was far more straightforward, I didn't know where it would end. But it ended up being published.
Okay, thank you. So there's a kind of a related question that follows on from that from Jane online, which asks whether writing from the perspective of a child made you think differently about some of your memories, or did it change the impact of what you remembered and experienced? So having to sort of revisit those memories and write them from the perspective of a child, has that kind of changed your experience of them?
Well, obviously, it actually induced certain memories. That was, I mean, even if you forgot the children's book, that was the great thing going back, that it actually, obviously everything changed. So Belsen was not there. because on the 15th of May, 1945, the British burned down Camp 1. As you know, they are the famous flamethrowers. That's it, yes. So, but in a way, it had two things. One is actually induced the memories, but also must have changed. So the question is a very good one, because things have changed, so it changed. But I try to imagine the original feeling rather than what I felt when I went back.
Okay, thank you. I think there's a question about what Hungary was like when you returned, and was anti-Semitism still rife? But you may feel like you've kind of answered that.
Yes.
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 So, and then Debbie's asked about the age, but the age group the book's aimed at. So I suppose what age of children really are you thinking of?
Well, I didn't think I wanted to write for children. Obviously, children in the early teens or below 10. The Times picked as the children's book of the week, and it recommended 10 plus. The publisher aimed at 8, because I think it's a category in children publishing, 8 to 12. The prize which I won by United Kingdom Literacy Association award for information book, which is obviously has a wide category, but it's from, I think, 4 or 5 plus to 14. So it depends obviously on the child's background. And
yes, and obviously many adults like graphic novels and other children's books as well. So it's for everybody. So there was a question here, I think. No, it's fine to speak.
Thank you. It was a privilege to listen to your talk tonight. I'm going to try and expand it slightly, but I'll be diplomatic. You hear a lot in the press.
sorry?
You hear a lot in the press
Yes.
and the media about Holocaust deniers. Now, that's one part of the question, but has the human race learned anything from the Holocaust? You hear all sorts of, say, genocides happening. Have we actually learned anything since the Holocaust? Because throughout history, we seem to...
Well, it's very difficult to answer. Events do happen. I mean, there were events even in Europe, in Bosnia, things going on in China. What I do hope that actually it cannot happen in Europe, but I do hope that it wouldn't happen elsewhere. I mean, what I learned that despite right-wing party in Germany, the Germans I talked to are very much against what happened, and no one actually would say it didn't happen. But I don't think that we actually learned enough. And that would require not to have an other event or genocide, to understand people whose mentality, ideology, completely opposite from ours, to have a tolerance for completely opposing views and ideologies, and don't hate. That is actually not easy. And that I know because my mother had a kind of an inner fight to hate or not to hate the Germans. I never had that, but in the end, she decided not to. So I don't know, looking at current events, I must say it's not very encouraging, but let's say doesn't happen. What time do you want to finish? I want to tell quickly another story, which relates to Belsen. Well, the story goes back to Easter 1945. In London Medical School, a note appeared asking for volunteers, senior clinical students from the 3rd year up, to go to the Netherlands to help the population, to help people, because there was a terrible famine. It's not all that well known, but it was epidemic proportion and people died. And many students volunteered. At the time, there were 12 medical schools in London, and they finally selected, I think, 96. They were trained, inoculated, ready to fly the Netherlands. In the meantime, the British liberated Belsen, and the priority became going to Belsen. So the 96 students went to Belsen. And it occurred to me when I was doing the research, I'm sure that some of the students will write about their experience in their hospital's medical journal. I should have said that at the time, all these medical schools in London, hospitals, had their journals, house journals. They exist no more. And I thought, well, they arrived there probably at the end of April. So I'm going to look at all of them, 12 sets of journals from the end of April, probably to the end of the year. And I found several articles, each quite moving, because obviously they were not quite doctors, but they did know the state of the people. And they didn't expect what they were going to see. And in one of the journals, which was St. Mary's Hospital Journal, I found a name which was very familiar, John Hankinson. I knew a John Hankinson who was professor of neurosurgery in Newcastle. But I didn't know whether the person I knew as a surgeon and the medical student volunteered to Belsen was the same person. So I thought I could clinch the argument if I look at the medical directory. And in the medical directory, I found John Hankinson qualified in 1946, St. Mary's Hospital Medical School. So it was the same, very same person who was in Belsen and whom I did know and met several times at medical conferences. So I decided to write a letter, which is something like, Dear John, we have met at many medical conferences, but you and I met nearly a most extraordinary place where you arrived on the 30th of April, 1945, but we left on the 6th of April, 1945, and that is Bergen-Belsen. He immediately answered, of course, it is me, and sent another copy of his article, which I already had. And he invited me to Newcastle. Obviously, I was retired, he retired 10 years earlier. And we had a nice day together with a lovely liquid lunch. At the end, as I was going, he produced a velvet pouch, which is very funny, from which he produced, can you see, a silver watch, a silver pocket watch. And he said, look, you must have it. He got it as a thank you from the British Army, and I understand that other medical students had a little present. But he had this, so he said, you must have it. And I said, no, it is yours. But he said, insisted, you have to. So I accepted it, and obviously it didn't work. I took it to, it's very beautiful. I don't dare to give it to you. And I took it to Mappin and Webb in Regency. They said, sorry, sir, we don't repair watches, but if you take to John Walker, 145 South Moulton Street, first floor, he will repair it. And he did. And I now have a functioning pocket watch from Belsen. Wow.
Well, a wonderful story to finish off on, and I think those medical students. I think we've at least got copies of some of the research that and records that were generated at Belsen by those students in our archive. If anyone's interested in that, just remains for me to say thank you so much to the audience for great questions online and in person, and thank you, Peter, for fantastic talk and other insights in the answer to the questions as well. So yes, if anyone wants to buy the book, or I'm sure Peter would sign books for those already, a couple of people who've already got them as well, then we'll move to that now. So thanks all for coming, and hope to see you again. Good night.
Thank you.